Good morning and good afternoon, good day, dear colleagues, and welcome again to this is Start Cafe. We are already 2 minutes past the start, so at this point in time, my name is Alec Nyasulu from Statistics Division of ESCAP here in Bangkok. Let me now invite Ms. Rike Hansen, who is the Chief of Section in the Economic and Environmental section of the Statistics Division here in ESCAP. Rike, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Alec, and a warm welcome to all of you who have tuned in to today's Asia Pacific Stats Cafe on a housing framework for the future. So thank you very much for being with us. Before getting into the topic of today's Stats Cafe, I want to mention that it is actually a very special session of the Asia Pacific Stats Cafe. It is namely Stats Cafe number 100 that has been organized for the Asia Pacific region. So please do join me in celebrating this centenary by watching a short video. And please play the video.
May 2020. At the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, the first Asia-Pacific Stats Café was held by ESCAP. Unable to meet in person, these cafes provided a vital space for knowledge sharing and collaboration, bringing together participants from across Asia and the Pacific. Early sessions focused on measuring the impacts of COVID-19, but the cafes have evolved to tackle a wide range of cutting-edge topics. Open to anyone, these sessions empower statistical officers, UN agencies, and partners to share and learn together. They are a testament to the strength of our regional collaboration. From using big data in tourism statistics, to estimating refugee and stateless populations, or looking at issues around data integration, or exploring the role of synthetic data in official statistics, these are just a few of the many topics we have explored. Today is our 100th Asia Pacific Stats Cafe. Let's take a moment to celebrate this milestone. Thank you for your support over the years, and we look forward to our journey of collaboration and knowledge sharing as we continue exploring new topics through our Asia Pacific Stats Cafe series. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. And I hope that many of you who are tuning in today have also benefited from some of the earlier many discussions that we've had in these very short cafes, but I think quite beneficial both to people tuning in as speakers as well as those of you who have been listening in. We here at ESCAP in the Statistics Division very much enjoy organizing them, and we do plan to continue as long as there is audience and volunteers in terms of speakers to share their knowledge. So thank you very much to all of you for having contributed also in the past. So let's get back to the topic for today, the Stats Cafe today, which is on a housing framework for the future. Now, this is not only number 100 Stats Cafes, it's also special in other ways. The Stats Cafe we are organizing today is part of the activities of the Global Network on Economic Statisticians, and it constitutes an effort to make the activities of the network more inclusive by organizing a sprint of the network in a time zone which is more conducive to the eastern parts of the world, and hence ESCAP is hosting the cafe today. I want to thank our colleagues at the Australian Bureau of Statistics for reaching out to ESCAP to host and organize today's cafe, which really will be a summary and to some extent a repeat of a sprint that has been organized by the Global Network and has comprised 2 webinars that were organized in the month of June and October this year. I want to also thank you to the co-leads of the network, the Maldives and Canada, for their leadership in network activities. And a special thank you today to Jean-Philippe Deschamps-Laporte from StatsCan for, in the name of inclusivity, to staying up very late to be with us during today's Stats Cafe. I will say close to nothing about the topic of today's Stats Café, because I have had a sneak peek of the video message from Stefan Schweinfest from UNSD, which we will play after I finish speaking. And he does elaborate both on the background to the Stats Café as well as on the topic and what has already happened at the global network webinars. So all I want to say is that the topic is important for measuring well-being, sustainable development, and it's also fascinating and challenging because it cuts across all traditional domains of statistics. So with that, I wish you a very good café, and I hand it back to Alec. Alec, please.
Thank you, Rike, for the remarks. At this point, we'll play a message from Mr. Stefan Schweinfest, the director of the United Nations Statistics Division. Thank you.
Welcome. Good morning. I'm Stefan Schweinfest, the director of the United Nations Statistics Division. Welcome to ESCAP's Regional Housing Sprint webinar, which is organized by the United Nations Network of Economic Statisticians in collaboration with the Australian Bureau of Statistics, Statistics Canada, Maldives Bureau of Statistics, UN Habitat, the Statistics Division of ESCAP, and UNSD. For those who may not be aware, the network was formed by the Statistical Commission in 2021 following the moderation of an extensive consultation on the future of economic statistics by the Friends of the Chair Group on Economic Statistics. The network aims to facilitate networking, coordination and communication on new innovations, experiments, and best practices for the purpose of making progress on priorities to keep economic statistics relevant. Why a regional sprint webinar? Many of you may know that since its formation, the network has successfully organized various sprints such as the Beyond GDP 2022 and 2023 sprints, International Statistical Classification sprints, Data Access sprints, Measurement of Inflation of Owner-Occupied Housing sprint, as well as the recently concluded Data Strategy and Housing sprints. Since sprints organized by the network are global in nature, the webinars are typically organized from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. New York time in order to maximize participation from various regions of the world. However, at the informal meeting of the network at the 55th session of the Statistical Commission in 2024, ESCAP observed that participants from the Asia-Pacific region might find it inconvenient in this time slot. Given the importance of housing in many parts of this region, the network subsequently proposed to organize a condensed version of the housing sprint under ESCAP's Asia-Pacific Stats Café series for countries in this region, and I'm very thankful to ESCAP for agreeing with this suggestion. Hopefully, organizing this webinar from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Bangkok time will help to address the above-mentioned inconvenience concerns. Also, organizing this regional sprint webinar is in line with the aim of the network to promote the experimentation and testing of inclusive working methods. Thus, if this experiment proves successful, we may consider organizing regional webinars for other sprints which are highly relevant to this region. The Asia and Pacific region accounts for approximately 60% of the world's population, underscoring the importance of housing. It is also home to some of the most densely populated cities globally, emphasizing the need for consistent and comparable housing statistics. Despite the rapid population growth in the Asia and Pacific region, Communal ways of living have largely been abandoned and replaced by housing models that emphasize individualism, where people live separately in isolated units. Housing is no longer viewed primarily, as it should, as a fundamental human need or as a space for fostering community, companionship, and mutual support. Instead, it has become a speculative commodity that can be traded for profit, especially as most countries in this region have become increasingly integrated into the global economy. This shift in perception is evident in real estate listings, which promote housing as an investment opportunity and a means of generating quick financial returns. One of the major challenges for the statistical community in the Asia and Pacific region, as is the case elsewhere, is the standardization of housing statistics. One such common example is seen in the International Comparison Program, ICP, when it comes to housing issues. This sprint and the development of a comprehensive housing framework offer a great opportunity to promote common standards across various modalities of data collection. This webinar has been made possible by the thorough work done by a planning task team comprising colleagues from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, Statistics Canada, the Maldives Bureau of Statistics UN Habitat, ESCAP, and my office, the UN Statistics Division. The team has worked together to shape the agenda for today's webinar. I would like to thank the team for the great work done and excellent collaboration. Also, I would like to thank all of the speakers, at least one of whom I understand is from a distant time zone, for taking the time to present the various topics on the agenda. While I regret that I will not be able to join you at the webinar, I nevertheless look forward to all of you actively sharing your insights and views during the webinar and wish you all a successful meeting. Thank you.
Okay. We'll now proceed to the next segment of the Stats Cafe, and I'll invite Ms. Jack Vitas, General Manager, Economy and Environment, ABS, who will chair the rest of the Stats Cafe. So I hand over to you, Jack.
Thank you very much, and I want to say that it's my great pleasure to be chairing this session today, and I hope we have some great input. I'm attending from one of the many lands in Australia, so and I know there's other people attending from Australia, so I'd just like to start by taking a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians that we're meeting on today, of the lands that we're meeting on today, and also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to also acknowledge any members of the Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander community that may be attending this meeting today. So as we've already heard from the introductory comments, this session will summarise the UN Economic Statisticians Network housing sprint that we've been having meetings about during 2024. And we'll also then take a deep dive into Statistics Canada's framework for housing data. And I'm not going to repeat, obviously, the importance that there is around kind of thinking about housing and the multifaceted dimensions of housing, because I think that's already been well covered. But I do want to embrace the fact that this is regionally an opportunity for us to get involved in the housing sprint. And as Stefan said in his introductory remarks, hopefully if this is successful, we can have more regional meetings like this. And I know for one where I attend, I'm sure like other people attending this meeting, many a night attending UN meetings and other international meetings, it's great to be attending this meeting today in daylight and not feeling so tired. So I hope that it is beneficial. So in terms of the session, we've got an overview that Jono will give us in a minute in relation to the sprints that have already taken place as part of the UN Economic Statisticians Network. Then we'll have a presentation around Statistics Canada housing framework for the future. Then there'll be just kind of making the case for having a housing framework, and hopefully we'll have enough time then for people to give any comments. Given we've got quite limited time, if you do have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat, because at least then we'll have a record of those, and we can maybe respond out of session if we do run out of time. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jonathan Koo, who's the program manager. So Jono works with me in the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and he's been involved in the sprints that have been taking place during 24, and he will give us an overview of those sprints. So Jono, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jackie. It's great to see everyone here at the sprint. And as like Jackie, very fortunate to be able to see you when there's daylight outside my window as well. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that I'm meeting on today. So I'm coming from Brisbane, Australia, traditionally called Meanjin, and I come to you from Turrbal and the lands of the Turrbal and Jagera people. So as Jackie said, I'm going to just share some slides. So hopefully these come through here to you now. They have come through. So, so I've just got a couple of slides to talk about the two webinars that we've already had on this housing sprint, just to, I guess, give you a bit of a summary of this key sorts of things that were discussed before Jean-Philippe goes through the detailed framework. So the first webinar we had was on the 26th of June. And it was titled A Multidimensional Integrated Housing Framework for the Future. And the webinar explored the development of a comprehensive housing statistics framework to assist in monitoring, understanding and addressing the multifaceted issues associated with housing across various regional and socio-economic contexts, some of which Stefan highlighted in his introductory remarks. So this first session looked to understand user needs and built the case for why housing data matters from the point of view of policymakers and other users. We heard reflections on some of the current global housing challenges being faced, such as population growth, land constraints, legislative issues, skill shortages, and the impact of climate change, and covered some of the key data needs and challenges in that space. Some of the presenters included, we heard from His Excellency Dr. Ali Hadir Ahmed, who is Minister of Housing, Land and Urban Development in the Maldives, and he spoke about the housing scenario and issues in his country, where there's significant gaps in both housing as supply and demand data, and those have highlighted the importance of data-driven housing policy and evidence-based decision-making. Kurt Uzovsky, who is in the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, he presented the US housing data landscape and complexities involved in the housing market analysis, including the use and increasing use of private sector data and challenges around subnational data sets and partnerships. Jonathan Hamber, who works at the Reserve Bank of Australia, he explained the role of monetary policy in the Australian housing market and how integrated data can help to challenge assumptions around policy effects, wealth and inequality, and rental dynamics. So that was a really useful session to be able to demonstrate some of the key user needs. The second part of that first webinar was a session which we took a deep dive into Statistics Canada's framework for housing statistics. I don't want to steal Jean-Philippe's thunder, so I won't talk about it too much, but one of the key things that I got from the conversation that we had there, it's in the diagram at the bottom right on your screen, talking about how we should be joining together the perspectives of social, economic and environmental lenses together. And it detailed a model for organising some of these dimensions as they relate to housing, both in terms of concepts and potential indicators. And the idea behind the framework is that it helps to provide some guidance to national statistical organisations, international bodies and policymakers to help frame housing issues and to guide analysis and support future data development. So some of the key highlights from the first webinar was that the multidimensional nature of housing and how it influences nearly every aspect of life and how it is critical to understand and articulate these concepts in order to measure them properly. Given the significance and complexity of housing, this type of framework is essential for transforming data into actionable insights that lead to meaningful improvements in housing conditions, both at the global level and also at the local level. The second webinar, building on the first, was on the 23rd of October. And this webinar focused on the innovative methods and practices for developing housing statistics, as well as common challenges encountered by national statistics organisations in producing housing data. So some of the examples of innovations in housing statistics that were showcased, I've got two of those examples to talk about today. The first was from my organisation, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, on their administrative data snapshot of population and housing. So this experimental census-like snapshot was built from linked administrative data, including state and territory government land records, federal government taxation information, health and education data as well. It also combined electricity consumption data and interactions with government services to provide new insights into housing vacancy and utilisation. You can see from the first, on the top left-hand side of the screen, I'll just grab my pointer. There we go. So up here, you can see one of the things that we're able to do with this data is to map dwellings that we thought were inactive or not being utilised both before and after COVID, which is a very interesting exercise and demonstration of how this data can be utilised. The other example of innovative housing statistics was from Statistics Canada, who shared an overview of their recent data developments in leveraging administrative data and micro-level information on physical infrastructure. Alternative data sources such as advertisements on websites on rental properties, tribunal data on evictions, residents of homeless shelters, and historical tax filings have made new insights possible, such as intergenerational housing outcomes, parent-child property co-ownership, and indirect transmission of wealth. And you can see some of the insights here in terms of the adult child home ownership rates in Canada as an example of some of those specific insights. In these examples, we heard some common challenges with this work, including the cost, quality, and complexity of private sector data, and the importance of partnerships and collaborations with other stakeholders. Particularly in national statistics organisations, often the information that we're talking about here is not necessarily collected for statistical purposes, and making sure that we're able to build strong working relationships with colleagues who might be utilising that data is quite important. We also heard from the OECD on the opportunities and challenges for house price statistics, with an emphasis on the importance of global comparability and improved granularity and timeliness. We also had a presentation from colleagues at UN Habitat who shared some of their ongoing efforts to develop a core set of global housing indicators, emphasising the importance of these in measuring progress against the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The webinar concluded with a panel discussion to delve into the complexities associated with developing housing frameworks and indicators. Panelists from Statistics Canada, the Kenyan National Bureau of Statistics,
refugee and stateless population
for Humanity discuss key considerations, benefits and challenges with this work. The webinar highlighted the importance of embracing new data sources and methods for producing housing statistics, and the fact that national statistical organisations and other information providers can no longer rely just on traditional data sources. However, the implementation of these new sources is not straightforward. There is often a large leap between the aspirational framework and on-the-ground reality, and direct data linkage is not always possible. There are also other considerations such as privacy and legislative challenges, technology and resourcing barriers, and this is particularly the case in developing nations. This emphasised the importance of a conceptual framework to underpin these new data sources and help focus the discussion. Another key takeaway from the session was the importance again of partnerships and also international
over the years, and we look forward to our...
So just expanding a little bit on that partnership part, it requires cooperation across all sectors of government, all sectors, including government, private, and the research sector, and is not just important for accessing the data, but also for how we can understand it more holistically and tell the full story. So I'll stop sharing my screen there. That's a summary of the two webinars that we had. I'd just like to also say that those webinars were both recorded. So whilst I've provided a brief summary, the full webinars are available if you are interested online at the UN Statistics Division website, and you're able to get all the insights that are available there. So with that, I'll stop my summary there and I will pass back to Jackie. Jackie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jono, and great overview of some great discussions that we've had internationally. So I'm not going to do any recap at this point. I'm going to hand straight over to Jean-Philippe, Jean-Philippe, I want to thank you for attending in most probably what's a terrible time slot for you. But I'm very much looking forward to hearing more about the framework that Jono mentioned in his update. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, ESCAP and ABS teams for inviting me today. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I'm joining you from Ottawa, Canada, and on the unceded traditional lands of the Anishinaabe people. While I pull my slides, I will do this right now. Go. Should be coming in a moment. Here we go. Right. So good morning, everyone. Jean-Philippe Deschamps-Laporte, an assistant director at the Statistics Canada. I'm in charge of portion of our programming when it comes to housing, and I will be discussing today the work we've been doing for the last 2 years, more or less, on sort of refreshing and modernizing our thinking on housing statistics. For us, for housing data has been coming from the census of population for about 100 years.
Here at ESCAP in the statistics division.
This is the first time where we had the rigorous information on housing, And traditionally, we've been relying on the system of national accounts and the census to inform the discussions on housing. Over the last 7 or 8 years, there has been a significant increase in programming around housing at the Bureau. So I'm listing here, I even ran out of colors, so there's some at the bottom of the slide, listing the different programs we have at the agency and the way we're organized. There are some falling in the social sphere and some in the economic sphere. So as we increased the information that we were producing, together with this came the need to better organize our thinking, ensuring that this is making sense and that we can tackle the issues going forward. So that's really sort of the genesis of this work at Statistics Canada, is the need to ensure that we're doing the right thing, that we are working with the right partners, that we are producing data. And as you know, producing data always takes time, so that we can sort of plant the seeds today and be able to rely on the adequate data going forward, especially as the world is changing. Canada experienced the second fastest demographic growth in the world last year. There are all sorts of challenges coming to us, and we are data stewards for the Canadian government, and in that sense, sort of this organization of our work really comes from this increased focus on housing. So there are many frameworks out there, so we first need to discuss, okay, why do we need another one for the specific question of housing? So in itself, housing is very much cross-cutting. We see it in our organization, we see it in the issues. That being said, the tools we have, they're not necessarily cross-cutting. You may have price statistics that do a very specific purpose, but that wouldn't really talk to other domains. And similarly, you may look at maybe a social outcome of housing, and you would have difficulty to tie it with other domains. There's a very well-established frameworks in health statistics, in labor statistics.
The Stats Café today.
You can really see sort of the life course of people, and there's a recognition that housing, when it comes to the way statistics are being produced, is not necessarily organized in that particular way, where you can track dwellings over time, can track people over their housing career as they begin their life with their parents as part of a household, form another household, and then sort of move on. It's actually quite challenging. So given the complexity, given the number of actors in Canada, we have sort of 3 tiers of government, and every tier has different responsibilities when it comes to housing. So there are many partners, the private sector is very present as well. That creates challenges to produce the right statistics. So there's really sort of this this environment that is part of the reasons why we in Canada need a new framework, and I'm here today to share our reflection on this. Official statistics on housing is often decentralized. I've mentioned this in just now, and Jonathan talked a little bit about the webinar where we spoke of our experiences producing statistics, leveraging administrative data, alternative data, AI, and so there's a need to organize all of this work. So beyond the organization, there is the development of new concepts, development of new measurement, and the element of storytelling, which is very important. It's not enough to just say how many people are struggling with their housing. We need to understand the drivers and the outcomes of these particular situations, and that framework helps us to frame these discussions and to ensure we talk about the right concepts. As mentioned, there's many other frameworks out there, and we sort of took that into consideration when building the system, so as to not duplicate and having a degree of coherency with the quality of life statistics we have in Canada, the SNAs, health as well. We did a little bit of a scan, and we came to the conclusion that there wasn't any pre-existing framework. There were certain pieces that exist. I don't know if we have colleagues from Stats New Zealand today. We sort of acknowledging the work they have done a few years ago on establishing a framework specific to housing quality. The OECD did really good work over the last 3 years or so, focusing on policy, and then would provide many of the bits and pieces you need to build a good framework. So it's sort of leveraging what is out there, but we couldn't identify sort of a coherent framework that really sort of provides the blueprint for a shared model. So building a framework all the way to data development and measurement is quite complex. So today I will really focus on the first initial 3 stages of our development strategy, which is, okay, what's the scope? How do we organize these concepts? And what's the relationship between those concepts? So I will not be specifically talking about indicators or the gaps that may exist and the data developments. That's sort of out of scope for today, as we're really going to focus on the conceptual approaches here. The way we have organized is a very rich world of concepts and relatively complex interaction between those concepts. It is borrowing from something that is used in policy evaluation. It's this logical model. When you have sort of an intended goal, let's say reducing poverty, it's sort of understanding what needs to happen to get there. So that's the way it's organized. The model is also organized with the view that each concept can be sort of mapped to indicator, source, and possible gap, but we're not doing this today. And ultimately, we argue through this model that the price of building material, the inflation in rents, or the pollution around dwellings, they don't matter on their own. They only matter in the way they affect people's quality of life. So each factor is laid out such that it flows to the quality of life framework. So that's sort of the logic, that the outcomes of the framework are all borrowed from pre-existing quality of life framework. And there's also a degree of simplification that is brought into this representation, in the sense that certain things like inflation, certain things like location, they are woven through the whole model, but to avoid repetition, they only mention one. And there's also the recognition that there could be sort of feedback loops, that certain things like immigration will, of course, support demand, but the immigration could also support the labor that is necessary to build new homes. But we're not sort of repeating concepts and not establishing these feedback loops for simplification. So the goal is really understanding, do we have the right concepts, and not so much should they be here or there, or should they be repeated. So it's a tool for ultimately to map to data holdings, whether they be from our national statistical organization, or they could also be coming from the private sector, for instance. In terms of scope,
2 webinars that were organized in...
I mentioned this. We would either look at housing using economic statistics. We'd use like the system of national accounts and look at the specific pieces that are in the system to understand specific questions. Similarly, we would use certain tools, asking households how they're doing, certain elements about the makeup of their household as it relates to housing. And we would do relatively little when it comes to built environment. Some element around energy mostly. So we had sort of these worlds that didn't really talk to one another. So the framework argues, and John mentioned this earlier, that in order to measure the issues of today, inform policy, and move forward when it comes to measurement, there's a recognition that these worlds actually overlap, and the perspective need to be shared between the different domains. So housing should really be seen as a confluence of these factors, and there's certain elements that fall both in social and economic statistics. And the way we sort of see society here is really about sort of individuals as they gather in different layers of household and communities. Environment here is seen sort of beyond the natural environment, but it's really sort of the physicality of housing, sort of the way buildings are set up and the way they are built as a neighborhood and in the larger environment around it. And the economic factors for housing in this particular context is really the notion of markets and choices, where prices are set, where risk is being assessed, where trade-offs are being evaluated. And ultimately, a very key factor is the pricing, obviously, for both ownership and rent. So what we're doing now, we're taking each of these factors and then we're breaking it down into concepts and organizing those concepts. And I will do this on the following slide. All of this comes, I mentioned this, Canada is experiencing very specific challenges when it comes to homelessness, housing prices, affordability. So there are certain key themes and policy focus that are present in Canada and that sort of also further motivate the framework that I'm going to present you in a moment. So from an economic standpoint, there are key questions. Is the private and public economics of home building? Is truly understanding the profit making, the labor aspects, the input prices to home building, that's not extremely well understood. We, of course, measure, we have price indices on building materials, we have a lot of information on these levels, but the way firms operate in that sphere is actually quite challenging. And similarly, on the public side, understanding like the cost of new infrastructure, urban sprawl, the way the state needs to facilitate new construction, those are really key questions that are present in the country, and we use the framework to inform those. Similarly, on society, we have rapidly changing demographic. I've mentioned this in a moment, but at the same time, we have baby boomers moving into retirement, and there's sort of big questions about whether they can age in place, whether we have the right housing for our changing population. And environmentally, I mean, this is a global issue, is the interaction of housing with the environment, specifically under the lens of climate change. The way floods are affecting housing and the way this actually creates an economic risk at the same time. Those are big questions that are present right now and further motivate the framework and sort of guide us in saying, okay, do we have the concepts to inform those specific themes and policy focus? So as I was mentioning earlier, we take each of the three factors, social, economic, and environmental, and then we break it down into a series of concepts that are some of them are already measured, some of them are not measured, and really sort of guiding this element of data development that I was mentioning a moment ago. So it starts by the traditional components of the demographic growth on fertility and migration, for instance, key elements to household formation and demand for housing. An element that we're not measuring right now, but it is key, particularly in very tight markets, this idea of suppressed households. Adult children staying with their parents, they're working, they're maybe saving, they may be not in.
I want to say is that the topic
a rental apartment, so those questions become more prominent right now in these high price markets that we are facing in Canada. You will see that each factor has the standing element of government policy, services, and action, recognizing the importance of the state in the framework. but also highlighting the difficulty we have in integrating specific information to understand who received the benefit, where the infrastructures are, and so we can really quantify the action and allowing for policy evaluation going forward. Another key input to understanding the social factors for the housing framework is individual preferences and expectations. They are well recognized
domains of statistics
world. This idea, like the Schiller idea of collective expectations, and this is not extremely well measured in Canada right now, and it's quite key in informing people's decisions. We saw, for instance, in the pandemic, a lot of first-time
good Café, and I have
low interest rates, but also expectations that certain things were going to happen. So better understanding these individual preferences and expectation is quite key in understanding housing demand, which is sort of a key theme here in this particular slide. But these factors collapse in population growth, aging, very important questions we have to deal with, and ultimately the way people end up owning, renting, or sometimes not having housing at all is sort of the second stage of the social factors. So once population grows, people find a home, there is this idea of sorting. Right, housing prices are such that certain people will move to certain places. At the same time, the identity, the background of people in Canada, the vast majority of immigrants move to the three big cities, and for a multitude of reasons. So the way people sort of cluster within cities and across the country is quite key to explain housing demand. Together with this comes this idea of social inclusion, diversity, and segregation. So you may have certain people that are priced out of certain areas, which will lead to a different kind of mix in the population, which has all sorts of consequences that are rather well documented. On sort of the flip side of this, there's this idea of community safety, social disorder, and crime that can come of poverty, and housing can be a key factors in explaining that sorting. Jonathan mentioned some studies we've done in the last year about understanding how generations move in housing, whether if your parents are renter, what's your chance of becoming a homeowner yourself? And given the fact that housing is the most important asset people own, and it tends to appreciate over time, there's this very important idea of economic, social, and housing mobility for in one's life, but also across generation. That's not very well documented, but is quite key in explaining the ability to move to a university that you would like to seek education in, and whether housing can be a barrier or an enabler to such opportunity. Another key theme that we're not measuring particularly well is this idea of social acceptability. Canada is facing challenges when it comes to adding housing supply, and given greenhouse gases emission, there's this push to have more dense urban housing. But pre-existing residents tend to oppose these new dense construction, or similarly, pre-existing residents may oppose social housing. So better measuring the social acceptability of change can help us understand barriers in new housing supply, for instance. Housing stability refers to this idea of that is included actually in the
economic statisticians
on adequate housing. the right to adequate housing specifically, and we would measure this through evictions, for instance, people who are forced to move in particular scenarios. And ultimately, as I was explaining, these concepts flow into specific domains of the quality of life framework. So all of these concepts sort of become nested in sort of key concepts we already have in in the quality of life framework, being social cohesion and connections, life satisfaction, and sense of meaning and purpose. So having people being able to move, to be with the community they would like to be in, to be able to move within one's life or across generation can lead to those particular outcomes from a conceptual standpoint. Next, we take the economic factors, and similarly, we sort of break them apart and we ask ourselves, okay, do we have these concepts because we believe that they matter in explaining housing outcomes, particularly as it relates to people's quality of life? Classic inputs to housing construction, labor, land, capital, and material, the sort of lending environment on financing and insurance condition, incentives, fees, and regulation, really sort of the core elements that allow residential construction. We have expectation, perception, and risk, maybe more at the level of firms. Right now in Canada, we have quite adverse environment for new construction for multiple factors in the way firms internalize this context. Well, it will inform their decision to build or not. For instance, and understanding sort of business sentiment specific to builders and developers is quite key as we're facing issues with housing supply. The way firms are organized, macroeconomic conditions also matter. Building technology, there's all this push for modular home building, 3D printing of components for homes. We're not really measuring these particular concepts right now. This is relatively new. Income and willingness to spend, both by households and firm, very, very key in explaining specifically affordability that I will cover in a moment. In terms of the second stage, you have rent, ownership costs, investments in construction, the time it takes for the construction. We're measuring this right now, but the approval, that could be very long, but we're not measuring that particular question in Canada at the moment. Productivity of firms, and also the sort of secondary impact of housing on other kinds, other domains of productivity when people have to move out very far away from the city because of housing costs. This will affect the match of employees to firms and can impact the overall productivity. Investor demand, Stefan mentioned this in his introductory comments. It's a big question. That's something we have started measuring. And there's very many facets to this because investors are essential to produce new housing. But at the same time, when housing is being traded like in the stock market, then it can become a bit opposed to this notion of the right to adequate housing at the same time. We have
on priorities.
We have sort of outcomes of these different concepts, which is ultimately new homes coming to the market in coordination with the homes that already exist, so the stock and the flow of housing, affordability for households as it relates to housing specifically, and given the fact that it's the number one budget element in people's monthly budgets, then this directly impacts their capacity to consume and to save. It's also people's largest debt, and with fluctuating interest rates, now we're in a downward trend in Canada at the moment. There's significant question about the overall indebtedness for households, and mortgage indebtedness is a key factor behind this. Jonathan mentioned something similar for the experimental work that was done in Australia, but the use of dwelling is quite key. We see this in Europe, we see this in many parts of the country, of the world, this idea of short-term rentals, whether it's vacant, it's just plain vacant, there's no usage. So understanding the utilization rate of the housing stock, it's quite critical, yet that's not something we've been focusing on historically. We've had vacancy rates for segment of the rental market, but we've never really thought about this idea of overall utilization of housing and better understanding what's happening and then guiding policymakers in maximizing the use of dwellings for residents to live in. I've talked a little bit about this earlier, municipal revenues and costs, specifically as it relates to the cost of infrastructures. We are trying to build more resilient cities, particularly with the changing climate. So the way these new infrastructure are financed is critical, because it could be at times a barrier to new supply when charges are imposed in the wrong way. So better understanding the cost of these new infrastructure and how they're financed is quite important, and that we have sort of more work to do in that specific domain. So again, all of these concepts flow into our pre-existing quality of life framework. Housing has been a tremendous source of wealth creation over time for households, can lead to financial well-being, but it can also lead to housing needs, to poverty, to homelessness, to food insecurity, when people, because people typically will pay their rent first and then will cut on other essentials, and then can lead to food insecurity. So really sort of making the argument that these economic concepts work hand in hand and flow to the fourth stage in that particular slide. So I hope I'm doing okay with time, Jonathan and Alec. Okay, excellent. I'm soon wrapping up. So a last factor that we probably have most work to do in terms of measurement is the interaction of housing with the built environment and the natural environment. So we start here in stage one by looking sort of, okay, where are those homes? We've talked in the previous slide, okay, how they come to the market, but the specific location and the attributes of the buildings and the units. Again, we've typically been measuring concepts around a number of rooms, the size, but that's quite limited. If you do hedonic price statistics, you want to have all these rich attributes. If you want to understand whether people caught COVID because they had more common space, then you need to measure sort of these attributes of housing that we're not necessarily doing. So it's really sort of emphasizing the importance of understanding the location and the attributes of the physical aspects of dwellings and residential structures. Another sort of initial concept in the environmental factors is the more natural geography and the pollution that exists. There are rules associated with the way we build, and whether it's about the building itself or zoning from the municipal
of the Statistical Commission, and
call them, sort of regulating what can be built and where can it be built. Maybe less typical concept for a statistical organization, architectural and design choices. The way homes are built, the way people can meet, can actually lead to different kinds of interaction between their occupants. So it's really emphasizing the importance of understanding these features that I was mentioning earlier, and that's not something we've been doing. So once you have the location of homes, then you can measure the proximity. I invite you to go and watch the recording of the second webinar we did with UNSD, where we talked about these measurements we have developed so we can measure the distance of homes to a variety of amenities for the entire country. And it's now available on Esri. It's a very powerful open data set that we've developed. So it's very, very important, this concept of proximity of homes to certain amenities and infrastructures. The location also gives us these new concept of density and sprawl. Until recently, we didn't have statistical concepts for those, and it's quite key, specifically as we need to measure better the contribution of housing to climate change. With climate change comes a new kinds and incidents and frequency of natural disasters. So that's another domain where we have not done much work, is to understand these systemic risks that housing has the most important asset of Canadians, this interaction with the risk of floods, seismic risk, and wind events. So that's something. It's a new concept for us, and we're developing new methods to measure that particular interaction. Energy use, energy efficiency. You may know Canada is a rather cold country, so understanding the physical features of homes and as it relates to the heating and the cooling and itself, its contribution to climate change. More energy efficient homes will produce less greenhouse gases. At the third stage, we have new concepts that we're borrowing from the maybe more environmental statistic, is this interaction of the urban setting with the natural setting, the biodiversity in cities, and sort of recalling this element of architectural and design choices. So the way we build homes matters, and it will matter as it influences people's quality of life. Location, again, will have a knock-on effect on transportation mobility choices. The features of homes will, as I was mentioning in the first factors, on the accessibility for seniors, for people with disabilities. We're not necessarily at the stage where we can measure these things very well, but it matters a whole lot as our population changes over time. And again, another concept borrowed from the right to adequate housing framework is this element of cultural adequacy. Are homes suitable for people to exercise their faith, their culture, their identity? It's a relatively new concept for us, and it's really about the physical aspects of housing and the proximity to certain amenities that can allow people to express their identity. And ultimately, these flow in existing concepts of quality of life, being health, life satisfaction, and sense of meaning. So I recognize I've thrown you probably 40 concepts organized in ways that is perhaps challenging. So I will maybe talk about the way forward. So from there, at the agency, we're moving closer to a measurement framework. Housing is a local
sprint webinar is in line with
in the world, but we don't have a Canadian housing market. We have about 3,500 housing markets because it's a municipal question. And we know through sample surveys, it's very difficult to have disaggregated data at the municipal level. So it's really calling the importance of administrative data to look for these rare events, but they are very meaningful. Not many people in their life will be evicted. Not many people will be homeless in their life, but those are very significant events. So having these rare events at the local level is extremely challenging through sample surveys. So it's really working with this administrative data, complementing it with survey data, but from businesses and households. It is our sort of strategy to move from those concepts to measurement, filling gaps, and improving our storytelling and governance. That's my second point here. That this myriad of programs, new programs that will need to be created going forward to address particular gaps that are emerging from the framework. That's sort of where we're moving. And then we have sort of specific analysis that we're working on right now that bring these different domains to have like more economic and flood question through housing, and to have sort of life courses of people who experience homelessness and eviction, and to really understand what is the cause of those eviction and what happens afterwards. That's a representation of where we want to move when it comes to our storytelling. And with that, we'll conclude my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Jonathan, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean-Philippe. Back to you, Jackie.
Thanks, Jono. No worries. Thank you so much, Jean-Philippe. And just to kind of bridge between your presentation and Jono's next agenda item is, I think it was a fantastic overview you gave us in terms of the development of a new conceptual housing framework and that logical model approach, and also the different and overlapping perspectives across the society and economy and environment. So thank you so much. And I think what I'm seeing very much is that, like, domestically and internationally, more and more our information needs are cross-dimensional. And so, like, our kind of traditional approaches to, you know, we produce economic statistics about society, statistics about the environment, but it's cross-dimensional. And so having this kind of framework approach is very powerful in helping us kind of respond to some of those growing needs. So thank you. There's one question, I believe, so far in the chat. So if you have the opportunity to respond to that, and we will have a little bit of time at the end for a few questions, but encourage people to use the chat. I'm going to hand over to Jono again now. So he's really going to look at, following the discussions that we've had at the webinars, it's making the case for having an international housing statistics framework. So Jono, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I am hopefully just sharing my screen now. So I think that, you know, Jackie's comments and sort of lead in very, very nicely to, I guess, sort of looking at next steps. And, you know, the purpose of running the webinars that we have is to think about, you know, trying to put together, I guess, a case for, you know, and trying to get a report together which sort of summarizes the consultations and presentations that we've had over the last since sort of June and October, having the presentations that we have in the context of the housing sprint. And really it goes to this point about the things that Jackie said and Jean-Philippe spelled out around looking at these different factors. We understand that housing statistics are complex, and at the international level, there is an opportunity to think about how we can perhaps potentially develop an international housing statistics framework that meets these complex needs. So as part of that, we are drafting a background report that will be presented as a background document to the next Statistical Commission next year by the Network of Economic Statisticians, and it will really, I guess, sort of provide that case to be able to sort of say why this framework is important. So I won't go through the report in too much detail now, but what I will say is that you know, what it does is it covers some of the topics that we've discussed, giving a background as to why housing is important. It will talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we've touched on around trying to measure the multidimensionality of some of those challenges, topics such as affordability, overcrowding, substandard housing, and also socioeconomic disparities that stem from housing. And and also talks about them in the context of some of the measurement problems that have been sort of highlighted through the webinars as well. The fragmented data collection methods, different conceptual approaches, and all these things impede the comprehensiveness that we need in terms of a data system that really does allow for effective analysis and policy making. It also the report sort of highlights some of the key concepts, some of which were outlined really nicely today by Jean-Philippe, talking about the fact that they are multidimensional, talking about how they do potentially link together in a logical way from an analytical perspective, and cover some of the key domains that Jean-Philippe talked about, particularly in the social, economic, and environmental domains. It also talks about the data collection and integration practices that are needed, the fact that we do need to integrate multiple different data sources, the fact that we do need to think differently about utilising those
which promote housing.
So the challenges that we have. We've got some case studies, and I touched on some of those earlier, either through the framework
as an investment opportunity.
Jean-Philippe talked about some of the experimental data sources as well that were highlighted in some of the other webinars as well, and some of the insights that could be gained by those that perhaps aren't able to be gained through our traditional statistical collections. So we should be able to provide a draft report in the coming days to participants, both for here in this Stats Cafe, but also to webinar participants as well over the last 6 months. And the group who've been drafting the primer or report is really keen to incorporate feedback. So if you we will be handing out there will be a form that's available as well to be able to provide that feedback, and we'll be looking to finalise a copy of the primer before the Statistical Commission. So yes, we certainly encourage people here, as well as others who you might know from a policy perspective, who might not be at the meeting today, to provide feedback. And before I hand back to Jackie, I did want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who has helped to prepare and edit to the report. There's a range of not just, and also the feedback that we've received through the webinars. So we've had people from UN
comparison program,
OECD, my own organisation, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the Maldives Bureau of Statistics, Statistics Canada, the Reserve Bank of Australia, Kenya Bureau of Statistics, United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, and also Habitat for Humanity. So really appreciate all the inputs that we've had from those organisations, and we look forward to receiving people's comments on the primer. With that, I'll hand back to Jackie, and Jean-Philippe, myself are more than happy to answer any questions that people may have. Jackie, back to you.
Thank you so much, Jono. So as Jono said, the work from the sprints during 2024 have got us to a position where we've got kind of an offering, but we'd really appreciate people's engagement with that and your feedback, and you might have experiences that are very relevant. There's opportunity now, so we've got about 10 minutes for people if they've got anything that they would like to ask or add their reflections, to please raise your hand. I can't see the chat, so I'm relying on Jono to tell me if anybody's doing anything in the chat. But this isn't the only opportunity. So as Jono said, we'll share the draft with participants and really appreciate any feedback you might have outside of this webinar. So I will throw it open to any questions or comments. Please raise your hand.
By the thorough work.
One question that we did have, Jackie. Oh, we've got the answer to that question. It was around the Jean-Philippe beat me to it around how do we keep the frameworks updated. So maybe thanks, Jean-Philippe, for answering that. But I'm not sure whether you wanted to expand on your answer to that.
Yes, of course, Jonathan. And sorry, I don't have access to the chat either. So the ESCAP team came to the rescue. It's still relatively recent. So we began the work last year. So we didn't have the need yet to refine it. Our goal is to have it as coherent and all-encompassing as possible with the scope we have set. So hopefully we don't need sort of frequent revisions, but we do know that there are certain things even that are being discussed in SNA revisions, like let's say solar panels, specific elements that we see are sort of emerging that we are likely going to need revision on a periodical basis. But at this point in time, this has not sort of been prominent. It was really about establishing it, working with our large community of partners in Canada, to have something that can be agreed upon, and right now we are sort of looking to finalize it completely, publish it through the primer, and that's sort of been our focus right now.
Thanks, Jean-Philippe. I might also add, certainly in the conversations that we've had as we've been drafting the primer, I think the other point I'd like to make is that there is an opportunity to refine. As Jean-Philippe has just said, we've obviously written what we have from the perspective of our own experiences and our
on the agenda.
But there are obviously a range of other experiences in countries as well that we'd like to make sure that we're reflective of, whether they be case studies, considerations of issues that may not be fully reflected in the framework so far. So we certainly recognise that and appreciate any feedback that that people may have.
Thank you both. At the moment, I can't see any other hands, which means then that I get to ask a question. So I think increasingly, as I was saying, just the comments at the end of your presentation, Jean-Philippe, is that increasingly we're seeing the need for us to think differently about how do we tell the statistical story about areas that are really, really cross-cutting. And so we're seeing more and more kind of frameworks being developed. My question is your perception in terms of how do we ensure that these different frameworks then can be integrated? So you've kind of got like almost a super framework that somehow all these frameworks fit within. So I don't know whether that's been an issue of discussion in Statistics Canada.
Excellent question, Jackie. Thank you. Yes, certainly. There is a certain degree of framework fatigue because there's many. There's always sort of this push to organize our thinking using those tools. But the diversity of existing frameworks also speaks to, like, they're also different. Some are more indicator frameworks and try to have something that boils down to one indicator, which is not really the purpose here. We don't sort of aim at having sort of three key metric to track each of the domain and that's perhaps not exactly the objective. So there's a conceptual relationship. I've mentioned several times the quality of life framework. It's really the guiding principle as to why all do these concepts ultimately matter is people's quality of life. There's specific elements from SNA, from health, and from environmental statistics. So there's sort of interfaces with those to ensure that we use the same concept, same measurement, because I wouldn't want us to have to develop different concepts that sort of speak to the same idea or notion. So it was really developed with the key strategy of coherency with existing frameworks and to tie it, but maybe not with the intention of having a super framework from a housing perspective. I hope that answers your question, Jack.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And it's I'm very good with coming up with ideas, as Jono knows. And some of them are good ideas and some of them are bad ideas. But I mean, just related to the frameworks, it makes me think about when we're doing data integration, we have a statistical unit, which is the key statistical unit for integration. And so like in Australia, we have one for around people and then business, and then hopefully one day around location. And I suppose it's trying to think about what are we learning from data integration that can help us then as we have these different frameworks, and like you say, make sure that they are consistent and coherent as well as relevant.
One of the other things.
Go ahead, John.
Oh, thanks, John. For
taking a moment to acknowledge that.
One of the things that I've really appreciated going, entering into this exercise and thinking about how we bring it together is how we're able to talk about quite diverse topics in a consistent way. And I think that's quite useful, both as we start to think about the information needs, so we all understand where we're coming from in terms of what information is available, but also because often these are multidisciplinary activities, being able to talk about the same concepts in the same way is actually really, really valuable. And I think that as statisticians, that's where we have a natural advantage, is that we do think, while we might not be building the super framework per se, we do try to think about what are the concepts and how do they all fit together. And I think that that's certainly something that I'm hoping that we can take through this exercise, the importance of how we can make sure that we do have that integrated thinking.
Thank you, Jonathan. And going back to your comment, Jackie, you're absolutely correct. We have very refined thinking historically on businesses, on individuals, their households, but we had to basically start from scratch on sort of the housing concepts, the way they are nested. So very specifically, we have a property. It could be a piece of land. We came to the agency with this concept of land, and people thought of land in a very different way. A land, there's a structure on it, and a structure may have one or more dwelling, and how these concepts nest with one another, how they're identified through the data, how they can be used to link to ownership information, inhabitants, so that you can sort of integrate the right keys together and really understanding these different layers of concept and statistical units that to facilitate this data integration, it's quite key. And we have to start from scratch. So 7 years ago, we didn't have anything. And building these registers, leveraging all sorts of information that were not made to produce housing data, that has been a very intense journey. And yeah.
Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to do one more check, but I don't see any hands. So I'd like to, Jean-Philippe and John, I'd very much like to thank you again for presenting. I'd like to thank the working group that's come from many different countries and been involved in organising the housing sprint during 2024. I'd also like to encourage everybody that's on attending today that, you know, we'll be sending out the primer. We'd really like to get your feedback. My understanding is that the primer will be included in a report from the UN Economic Statisticians Network that will go to the United Nations Statistics Commission in early March 2025. So if you have any kind of strong reactions in support or otherwise, it would be really good to hear from you now, so that we can make sure that we incorporate that. But thank you very much to UN ESCAP for organising this. I know I have very much enjoyed being fully awake in a normal time zone to participate in this. So thank you very much. Thank you everybody for attending, and I hope that it's been very valuable and given you some food for thought. So thank you. Was there anything else that you want to say, Alec?
No, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day or night or wherever you are. Thank you.